Welcome! This is the first part of a two-part screencast on hemophilia. In Part A, we will talk about basic biology of the disease. In the second screencast, we'll get more into the history of the disease. At the beginning of class, we talked about the fact that blood will clot or coagulate, become a solid, to stop bleeding. Some people have an inherited condition which prevents them from being able to clot their blood because they do not make all of the chemicals necessary for coagulation to occur. These people suffer from a rare condition known as hemophilia and may bleed extensively from even a small bump or cut. This is evidenced in the picture on the right, which shows extensive bleeding under the skin suffered by a hemophiliac who had an injection in the buttock. Blood clotting is a complicated process that requires a series of chemical reactions. In order for blood to form a clot, many chemicals must be present, including chemicals which are known as clotting factors. There are 12 known clotting factors, and they are named based on the order of their discovery. So clotting factor 1, clotting factor 2, clotting factor 3, and so on. All 12 of these clotting factors must be present in sufficient amounts for a clot to form. If one is missing or deficient, the blood clot will not form, and this is the case for someone who suffers from hemophilia. They are deficient for one of the clotting factors and unable to clot. The most common type of hemophilia is hemophilia A, which has come to be known as the royal disease. This is because it has afflicted most of the European royal families, which we will talk about more a little later. Hemophilia A affects almost exclusively males, and it is incredibly rare to see a female with this form of the disease because it's carried on the X chromosome. People who suffer from hemophilia A have an X chromosome with a mutated gene. The mutation is in a gene that produces one of the clotting factors, clotting factor 8. Because of the mutation, those with the disease are unable to produce enough clotting factor 8, and that makes it very difficult for them to clot their blood. Hemophilia B is an even more rare form of the disease that also affects almost exclusively males because it is also caused by a mutation in a gene on the X chromosome. In the case of hemophilia B, the mutation is in a gene that makes another of the clotting factors, in this case, clotting factor 9. Hemophilia C is a more mild form of hemophilia where bleeding problems are not as extensive as in hemophilia A and B. Because the gene that causes this type of hemophilia is found on a somatic chromosome as opposed to the X chromosome, it affects males and females in equal numbers. With this form of the disease, sufferers are unable to produce sufficient amounts of clotting factor 11. Because hemophilia is such a severe disease, it is usually diagnosed very early in life. Most people that suffer from the disease have a family history of it, and genetic testing makes it possible to diagnose it before any bleeding episodes have occurred. It is even possible to diagnose it in the fetus. If a child is born with undiagnosed hemophilia, chances are they are going to be male, and at least in the United States, there is a high likelihood that the child will be circumcised at birth. The circumcision process would lead to extensive bleeding so that the child would likely be diagnosed at that time. In fact, there was an old Jewish law that said if a woman had borne 2 sons that died from bleeding when circumcised, her third son would not need to be circumcised. The Jews recognized hemophilia thousands of years ago and also recognized that it ran in families. I've got a list here of some of the common signs and symptoms of this disease. The first is a prolonged bleeding time. It's difficult to get bleeding to stop from even a small bump or scrape. The second is easy bruising. All of us get little micro tears in blood vessels from normal activities and wear and tear in the body. For most people, these micro tears immediately seal because the blood clots, but for hemophiliacs, they will have more extensive bleeding under the skin. Blood in the urine and/or the stool and nosebleeds for no apparent reason are seen as well. Lastly, most hemophiliacs have serious joint destruction due to repeated bleeding into the joint cavity. This happens, again, just due to normal wear and tear in our bodies, which causes little micro tears in blood vessels. In someone with sufficient clotting factor, bleeding stops almost immediately because the blood solidifies. In a hemophiliac, the bleeding continues. Synovial joints in our bodies take a lot of wear and tear, and in a hemophiliac who can't clot their blood, blood can build up in the joint cavity. This can cause extensive swelling of the joint, as evidenced by the picture of this boy's knee. The blood is very irritating and inflammatory to the joint, and over time can lead to permanent and severe joint damage. I mentioned earlier that the genes that cause the 2 most severe types of hemophilia, A and B, are found on the X chromosome. If you've had a biology class before, You've probably learned that females have 2 copies of this X chromosome and males have only 1. So when an XX female reproduces with an XY male, she gives one of her X chromosomes to her offspring. It doesn't matter which one, and the process is completely random. The child has a 50% chance of inheriting one and a 50% chance of inheriting the other. An XY male can pass on either his X or his Y chromosome to his offspring. If he passes on his Y chromosome, his offspring will be male because he has one X chromosome from mom and one Y chromosome from dad. If instead the male passes on his X chromosome, his offspring will be female because she has 2 X chromosomes, one from mom and one from dad. And again, there's a 50-50 chance that dad will pass on his Y and have a son, and a 50-50 chance that he will pass on his X and have a daughter. The process is random. All of this leads to some problems for males. Because females have 2 X chromosomes, they have 2 copies of every gene on the X chromosome. So if one of their X chromosome genes is mutated, it's okay because they have another one that can act as a backup. For males, this isn't the case. Having only a single X chromosome, they don't have a backup if there is a mutated gene on their one and only X. This is also why color blindness is more common in males. The genes that allow us to see in color are carried on the X chromosome, and males only have one. So back to hemophilia. Because males have only one X chromosome, if that one X has the mutated gene for hemophilia A or B, they will have the disease. Since females have 2 X chromosomes, they have a backup. Both of their X chromosomes would need to have the mutated gene for hemophilia in order for them to inherit the disease. And since the hemophilia gene isn't tremendously common to begin with, most females don't have even one of these genes, and it is really rare, about 1 in 100 million, to see a female with 2 copies. Females that have a single mutated X carrying the hemophilia gene are what are known as carriers. They do not have problems with blood clotting, but they do carry the hemophilia gene, which they can pass on to their children. This concludes the first part of the screencast on basic biology of hemophilia. In the second part, we will be talking about probably the most famous hemophilia carrier of all time, Queen Victoria of Great Britain.